Ever get that feeling like you're being subtly, maybe not so subtly, nudged in a certain direction, like even when it comes to your own thoughts?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
That's exactly what we're diving into today, perception manipulation. We're using two really interesting books as our guideposts today. Dr. Julie Smith's Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before? And David Icke's Everything You Need to Know But Have Never Been Told.
Two very, very different perspectives.
Totally. But they both touch on this idea of influence, right? How it shapes our reality, both in our own heads and out in the wider world.
Yeah, it's that connection we're going to unpack today.
Let's start with Dr. Smith. She kicks things off with something I think we can all relate to. Those everyday things that can drag us down, like, hitting the snooze button for the 10th time.
One of the worst.
Or that feeling of, ugh, when you see your to-do list.
Yeah, or even just waking up already feeling behind.
She actually uses that exact example, waking up irritable after a late night of work. I've definitely been there.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example of what she calls the cross-sectional formulation. Basically, it's this idea that our physical state, our emotions, our thoughts, our actions, they're all intertwined.
Intertwined. How?
Like, imagine them as strands in a web. When one is off-kilter, it affects the entire structure.
Okay, I'm following you. So how does that play out in real life?
Let's stick with that late-night work example. You're physically tired, right?
Right.
That tiredness can then make you feel irritable, which makes it harder to get out of bed and face the day. So you hit the snooze button, which might make you feel even more stressed because now you're running late.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. And this is especially true when it comes to those low moods. It can be a real cycle.
But it all starts in our own minds and bodies, right?
Exactly. And the good news is once you understand this connection, you can start to identify those patterns, those thought patterns, and break free from the negative cycles.
And that's where Dr. Smith's book really shines, I think, because she gives you these actionable techniques to combat those negative thought patterns. One that stood out to me was thought observation. Have you ever tried that?
Oh, yeah. It's a game changer. Seriously.
How so?
Instead of, battling those negative thoughts head on, which honestly can make them stronger.
Yeah, it's like they feed off that energy.
Exactly. You just observe them without judgment.
Just observe.
Yeah, it's like watching clouds drift by.
Yeah.
You acknowledge them, but you don't let them consume you.
That's such a great analogy. So it's about creating separation. Right.
Exactly. Between you and your thoughts.
You're not so swept up in them.
Yeah, and that detachment, man, it can be so powerful for breaking the hold those negative thoughts have on you.
Okay, so that's thought observation. Another technique Dr. Smith talks about is something I've been hearing a lot about lately, gratitude practice. Sounds cheesy, but
But it works.
it really does, right?
Yeah.
She explains that intentionally focusing on even the smallest things you appreciate, like really small moments of appreciation,
Right.
it can actually shift your mindset from negative to positive.
It really can.
She even suggests keeping a gratitude journal. Do you think that helps?
Absolutely. Because when you're consistently writing down those things you're grateful for, you're retraining your brain to seek out and appreciate the good,
Even amidst challenge.
especially amidst challenges.
It's like actively rewiring your brain for positivity.
Exactly. You got it.
So if our minds are naturally, maybe because of how we evolved or whatever, inclined to focus on the negative, like always looking for things to stress about, gratitude is like hitting the reset button.
Love that. Hitting the reset button.
When instead of looking for the stressful stuff, we're seeking out stuff to appreciate.
Exactly.
I love that. Now, it's interesting because Dr. Smith wraps up this section by talking about making values-driven decisions, which to me feels connected to this whole idea of like taking control of your thoughts and actions.
Oh,
And
totally.
it's all connected.
100%.
Yeah.
Because instead of chasing this idea of perfection, which, let's be real, it's often unattainable and just leads to a lot of self-criticism,
Yeah. Who needs that?
she encourages aiming for good enough choices.
Good enough.
Choices that align with your core values and, actually move you closer to the life you actually want to be living.
So it's about being intentional, right? About
Yeah.
the decisions that we make, making sure they reflect what truly matters to us rather than, getting caught up in what we should be doing.
Love that.
Okay, so we've been exploring how our own thoughts and perceptions can influence our reality on a personal level. But what happens when those influences are coming from external sources? That's where David Icke's perspective comes in,
And that's where things get really, really interesting.
because he takes this idea to a whole other level.
He does. While Dr. Smith is focused on the individual, Icke zooms out, like way out, to examine how similar manipulation tactics are playing out on a much larger scale.
A much larger scale. Okay, so let's zoom out with him. What's the global scale manipulation look like in Ick's view?
Well, Ick argues that there's this group, he actually calls them the cult, that's operating behind the scenes, pulling the strings.
Pulling the strings of.
Governments, media, financial systems, you name it, basically shaping world events to fit their agenda.
Okay, so we're talking about a full-blown conspiracy theory here.
You could call it that. I mean, his work is definitely controversial.
That's putting it mildly.
Right. But remember, we're here to explore these ideas, unpack them, not necessarily to say we believe them.
Of course, of course. So how does this cult, as he calls them, actually exert their influence? What are their methods?
Well, Ick lays out a few key tactics. One that he emphasizes is called problem reaction solution.
Problem reaction solution. Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
So picture it like a three-act play. Act one, you have the problem. This could be anything that creates a lot of fear and uncertainty, a global pandemic, an economic crash, a climate disaster.
Something that really shakes people up.
Exactly. And that leads to Act two, the reaction.
Which is?
People panic. They become desperate for a solution, for someone to tell them what to do, how to be safe.
Makes sense. So they're primed for.
Act three,
Hmm.
the solution, which, according to Ick, is usually something that was already planned out in advance.
So the cult, in Ick's view, they're orchestrating these crises, or at least taking advantage of them.
That's the idea, to manipulate perceptions, use that fear to control the narrative.
And this manipulation, it's not always blatant, right? I mean, sometimes it can be really subtle.
Absolutely. He talks about another tactic called the totalitarian tiptoe.
Totalitarian tiptoe. Okay, now I have to hear more about that one. What is the totalitarian tiptoe?
So think about it. Freedom, it's not always taken away in one fell swoop in some dramatic power grab, right?
Right.
It can happen gradually, almost invisibly, through these tiny little steps.
So people don't even realize what's happening until it's too late.
Exactly. It's like that old analogy, the frog in the pot of water.
Oh, right, where the water heats up so slowly that the frog doesn't jump out.
Exactly. So by the time it realizes it's boiling, it's too late.
That's a pretty disturbing thought. Does Ick tie these ideas to any specific real-world events?
He does, yeah. One example he points to is the COVID-19 pandemic.
The pandemic. So how does that fit into this problem reaction solution model?
Well, in Ick's view, the pandemic, whether it was intentionally created or just capitalized upon, served as the problem.
Yeah.
It caused widespread fear, uncertainty,
Definitely.
and that led to people readily accepting solutions that they might not have otherwise, like lockdowns, mask mandates, mass vaccination.
Solutions that could be seen as increasing control over the population.
That's how he sees it. He even questions the virus's origins, the accuracy of the testing, the safety of the vaccines.
Now, hold on a second. Just to be clear to our listeners, we are not endorsing those particular views.
No, of course not. These are just examples of how Ick interprets events through his framework.
Right. It's crucial for everyone to do their own research, form their own conclusions.
Absolutely.
But I'm curious, does Ick apply the same problem reaction solution framework to other global issues? Like, what about climate change?
He does. Ick sees climate change as another potential example of this manufactured or at least highly exaggerated crisis.
To push a certain agenda.
Right. He'd say it's being used to justify things like global governance, carbon taxes, restrictions on personal freedoms.
Things that some people see as necessary to save the planet and others see as a power grab.
Exactly. And in Ick's view, both the pandemic and climate change, these are just two examples of how fear is used to manipulate public perception.
So we're constantly being bombarded with these fear-inducing narratives, whether it's a virus, a changing climate, or something else entirely.
Right. And Ick believes that this manipulation is happening everywhere in the media, in government, and increasingly through technology.
And that brings us to another area where Ick is, shall we say, outspoken. Technology.
Right. He's very wary of what he calls control through technology.
Control through technology, what does that look like?
He sees things like artificial intelligence, 5G networks, the Internet of Things.
Basically, everything becoming interconnected.
Exactly. He sees all that as creating these unprecedented opportunities for surveillance and control on a massive scale.
It's like something out of a dystopian sci-fi film, isn't it?
Right. Our every move tracked, our data collected, our thoughts and behaviors potentially being influenced by algorithms we don't even understand.
Okay, so we've gone from managing our own personal thought patterns with Dr. Smith to Icke's view of this potential global manipulation network. It's a lot to process.
It is. But what I find fascinating is that these two perspectives, they're not entirely unrelated.
It is a lot to process, but I think you're right. They're not entirely unrelated. On one hand, we have Dr. Smith's advice on managing our own minds, and on the other, we have Icke's theories about these systems of control. But could understanding one actually help us navigate the other?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think the answer might be yes. Think about it. Dr. Smith gives us these tools, right, to understand and manage our own thoughts, our reactions. And those tools could be really useful in a world where, as Icke suggests, there might be forces deliberately trying to influence us.
So we take those individual insights and apply them to the bigger picture,
Exactly. Like, remember Dr. Smith's point about emotional reasoning?
where we mistake a feeling for a fact.
Right. And how often does that happen in the real world? We see a scary headline, we feel that surge of fear, and suddenly we're convinced that, the sky is falling, even if we haven't really stopped to examine the information objectively.
It's true. Our emotions can be so powerful, but they can also really distort our thinking.
Totally. And what about gratitude practice? In Icke's world, where fear is a weapon, could cultivating gratitude actually be a form of resistance?
That's a really interesting thought, because if we're making that conscious choice to focus on the good, to be grateful for what we have, maybe we're less susceptible to those messages of fear and scarcity.
Exactly. It's like building up an immunity to negativity. And speaking of resisting outside pressure, what about Dr. Smith's advice about values-driven decisions? Icke argues there's this push for conformity, right?
Right.
So in that kind of world, wouldn't making choices based on our own values, our own internal compass, be a way to hold on to our individuality, our freedom?
I love that. Because if we know what's important to us, what we stand for, it's easier to resist those external pressures, to make choices that feel authentic, even if they go against the grain.
Yes, define your own reality instead of letting it be defined for you.
That's powerful. So whether or not someone fully buys into Icke's theories, his work definitely pushes us to think more critically about the information we're taking in.
100%.
To question those narratives we're being sold, ask ourselves who benefits from us accepting those narratives as truth.
Exactly. And how are those narratives, whether we realize it or not, shaping our perceptions, our choices, even our realities?
It's about taking ownership of our own minds, our own beliefs. And I think that's a great message to wrap up on, don't you?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's about empowering ourselves to see the world with clear eyes, you know, to make choices that are truly our own.
I love that. So that wraps up our deep dive into perception manipulation. We've explored the inner workings of our own minds with Dr. Julie Smith and taken a look at the bigger picture with David Icke's theories about systems of control. We've covered a lot of ground, and some of it's been pretty intense, but hopefully it's given you some things to think about.
And some tools to work with.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, knowledge is power. The more you understand about how your mind works and how outside forces might be trying to influence it, the better equipped you are to navigate the world and create the reality you want to see.